What Scrooge said, well, you all know what Scrooge said, right? Scrooge said, right. And we do all feel that way sometimes during this holiday season, of course. It's supposed to be a time of peace and joy, and maybe we'll get there eventually, long about Christmas Eve at 7 or 8 p.m., or maybe even Christmas Day along about 7 or 8 p.m. But the run-up tends to be pretty tense in American society. We're already harried enough, most of us. And then there's a complex set of extra expectations during this season: gifts to buy, decorations to put up, parties to go to, solicitations to open and respond to, including that one you got from the church just yesterday. And the stores are crowded, and the kids are hyped, and the little drummer boy is tapping away everywhere. No more welcome on his little drum, the muzak, than he must have been at the manger. So let's just say it again, with feeling. Bah humbug. Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge lived at a time when Christmas was changing as a holiday, moving from what it had been a minor Catholic holy day to an all-out cultural marathon. And his reaction, to this new holiday has become a part of our language. But Scrooge was not just sour about holiday madness. He had an attitude about everything. Charles Dickens wrote about him, "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and on his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature about him always. He iced his office in the dog days, and he didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas." Scrooge's nephew wanders into the shop to wish him a Merry Christmas and invite him to dinner. "Bah humbug," says Scrooge, and he won't come. 2 men come in collecting for the poor. "Bah humbug," said Scrooge, "I pay my taxes to support the prison, the orphanage, and the workhouse. Let the poor work for a living as I do." Does this sound familiar? The poor clerk doesn't even bother to ask for more coal for his poor fire. He knows the answer will be no, so he huddles in his overcoat all day, as Scrooge does. Scrooge is a tough case. He cannot give of his money. He cannot give of himself. He's so sure of his independence that he is as nearly alone as a man can be and still live, and his life is joyless. Charles Dickens and Ebenezer Scrooge lived at a time when economic change had created, as it so often does, a new class of fabulously wealthy people. A beleaguered group of well-off but very worried people, and a lot of desperately poor people who could hardly call their lives their own. They were so buffeted by the slings and arrows of economics. Does this sound familiar? It turns out that just as freedom isn't free and must always be fought for, so a just distribution of wealth in a society is not natural to capitalism and must always be fought for. Dickens himself had once been one of those so poor they could hardly call their lives their own. His father fell out of the middle class, fell into debt, and was sent to prison because of it. That was the habit of those days. And young Charles had to leave school and work in an abusive situation for several years. His painful experiences in that workplace provided considerable material for his later art and considerable fuel for his passions for decent working conditions for everyone, but especially for children. And for a Christmas season which revolved not around traditional religion, He was, as you have heard, a Unitarian. Or around the gross national product, but rather around family, relationship, and generosity. He wanted, in contemporary language, to be part of the formation of a holiday season which was spiritual but not religious, joyful but not frenzied, and he fancied that hearts open to the joys of relationship and generosity at Christmas might just stay open all year. A Christmas Carol was actually the last of several stories he wrote to this end, and it became the most famous, and it did indeed shape our society. As familiar as we think A Christmas Carol is, let's see if we can let it shape us. To tell this story and move us and shape our attitude, we need to identify with Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge. And to do that, we have to, I know that none of you are ever this rude, but we do have to understand that Scrooge was not a wealthy man. Scrooge was not of the 1%, so wealthy that he was removed from all concern about money and whose psyche might seem out of our ordinary understanding. No, it's clear that Scrooge is of the beleaguered middle class, one of the worried well-off in his economically changed situation. He has some wealth, but not enough to be easy about using it. He didn't just deprive his clerk of coal for the fire, after all. He deprived himself, too. And he had planned oatmeal for his own Christmas dinner in his dreary, cold, 3-room flat. No, Scrooge was not one of the lavishly wealthy 1% throwing around his money to impress his wealthy peers. It's true that his penchant for worry and miserliness was quite over the top, the result, it seems, of wounds and scars from his childhood. But his form of reaction to the economic squeeze, which was to isolate himself, to feel helpless, to blame those worse off for his problems, and go around acting like a troll, those reactions are seen even in those who can't claim to be nearly as damaged as Scrooge was. We actually see this all around us. We see it on the news, we see it on comment pages, we see it in the political campaigns. The day I went out with the Occupy demonstration last fall, someone sitting at ease in a sidewalk cafe shouted at the group, "Why don't you all just get a job?" A pretty direct variation on Scrooge's "let the poor work for a living as I do." Boy, I'm having trouble this morning. Excuse me. But we can't absolve ourselves of Scrooge's strategies for dealing with economic change. We also, perhaps, have at least thought about cutting back on our generosity. We all live by ignoring the results of our choices on others. And some of us have resolved to keep our economic position in the world by an extreme focus on work, which is perhaps out of proportion with necessity and which is keeping us from enjoying our relationships and our lives. We may have better tempers than Mr. Scrooge and better manners, but actually, he's no stranger. Of course, the ghost part of the story is going to cure him of his temper, but let's be clear from the beginning that it's not going to make him a wealthy philanthropist whose life is any different from most of ours. No, Scrooge starts out as a fellow who's adjusted to scary changes by adopting the "I am a rock, I am an island" strategy. And since I'm not a rock and I'm not an island, somebody's brought me water. Oh, that's much better. He's adopted an "I am a rock, I am an island" strategy, believing and acting as if he is untouched by others and becoming non-responsive to their pain. What his night of uncomfortable truths is going to do for him is bring him back into the company of the human community and teach him that he lives in a web of relationships. His ghosts are going to remind him that joy comes not from having enough that we will never have economic worries, but rather from sharing what he has with others. and that such security as he will have in the world will come not from hard-headedness, but from soft-heartedness. These ghosts are going to ask him to notice the choices he has made and implicitly suggest that other choices might be more profitable. And while the speed of Scrooge's emotional turnaround is probably a part of the fairy story, the basic therapeutic strategy is sound, and we can use it for ourselves and with ourselves if we have found ourselves reacting to economic change in any similar sorts of ways. Scrooge's night starts with a visit from his old partner, Marley. Dead these several years, dead as a doornail, as it's made very clear, but mysteriously appearing on the door knocker, and then in Scrooge's cold flat. Marley is, it seems, condemned to wander the world, teaching others the lessons of humanity that he did not take the opportunity to learn in this life. At first frightened, and then disbelieving, Scrooge tells Marley's ghost that he is actually the result of Scrooge's indigestion, a skepticism which gives him another thing we can have in common with him. Then he is simply puzzled. Scrooge finally takes in his old partner's words and current sufferings. "But you were always a good man at business," he protests, whereupon the ghost delivers himself of the basic message of the story. "Business," cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." Marley's ghost buddies, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, take Scrooge on a spiritual journey and show him things that melt his heart, that connect him to others, that help him give and take more freely. We can be on the same journey in our imaginations. The ghosts show Scrooge his past, which in spite of its wretchedness has elements of goodness and love which he had forgotten. They remind him that he has connections with loved ones, that there are things to feel grateful for in his history. The ghosts know that generosity is born out of connection and gratitude. Our memories, too, can bring us connections and gratitude. They can bring people and faces and times into our mind's eye and make them a part of our actions. We so easily forget the good things that have happened to us. If a ghost of Christmas past, therefore, showed up at your bedside, what scenes might you be shown, do you think? What moments of care and love formed your life? Do you have icons of relationship which come readily to your mind? One of my icons of relationship is our family dining room when I was growing up, set for a holiday dinner. We usually ate in the kitchen as a family. But on holidays, placemats and china came out, and each child had her own favorite food, mine was black olives, to pass around in a special dish. And a plate was always made for the dog and put before her on the floor. An important thing, though, that we were all there, that we were all together, that we were all family, gathered in, catered to in love. Do you have such a scene somewhere in your life? A scene for which you can feel a warm gratitude? If so, the ghost of Christmas past has done his work for you too. It is to be noted that Scrooge's heart was transformed by the first ghost although he still had things to see and lessons to learn. He went willingly with the second and even the third ghosts. The memory of love is that powerful. The Ghost of Christmas Present shows Scrooge the present, a vision of possibility, that one might be glad and grateful for life and its gifts, even in cold and miserable weather, even in poverty and uncertain health and anticipated grief. In the streets of London and in the home of his clerk, whom Scrooge has never really known, he sees gratitude, joy, human compassion, and love. He even hears his own name toasted by Bob Cratchit, his employee, although he also hears Mrs. Cratchit's more bitter account of the results of Scrooge's miserly pay scale and bad temper. Our imagination, too, can bring us into sympathetic connection with those around us, can see examples of people living in joy and gratitude and love in spite of all kinds of difficulties and deprivations. If the Ghost of Christmas Present conducted you to such a scene, what would it be? Your own family, perhaps? Someone you know who has managed difficulty with forbearance and joy? The scene that comes to my mind was described to me last Christmas by Josephat Meunier, the minister of the Unitarian Church in Kittengela. This church has about 60 children, 30 of whom are orphans being fostered in church families. These are the children we've helped to stay in school with our August collections. But the scene that I'm thinking of took place last Boxing Day, which is a holiday of Great Britain, which takes place the day after Christmas, and is a day when gifts are given to the poor. Now, mind you, every member of the Kittengela Church, as far as I can tell, would be considered poor by our standards. They struggle to scrape enough money to pay for school fees every year, after all. Although Josephat's family has a few amenities, like a TV, his job, when he can get it, is working in a quarry. And he once wrote to me that as he's getting older, he finds he can't sleep after a day's work. It's so hard. You get the picture, I'm sure. But he's also the leader of a church where, on Boxing Day, the children are invited to bring any extra school supplies they have, and those are put together in bags and then delivered in a large congregational round to the poorest families in the church, the ones who, as he says, live in terrible poverty. It's a good thing to do, he wrote me last year, with great pleasure evident in his email writing. We all feel good about being able to help others. That's my own personal Ghost of Christmas Presents story, reminding me that life is so much more than my anxieties, and that it is in giving and relationship that we all find joy. Do you have such a scene that you could call to mind? The Ghost of Christmas Future shows Scrooge a possible future of a lonely death at the end of a life which has meant nothing to those around him. This will not be anyone's fate here, I'm sure. You're all part of this community, after all, and if of no other, and we remember and memorialize our own. The Ghost of Christmas Future is a good reminder, though, that we too must attend to our need for meaning and for touching the lives of others. By this time, Scrooge is thoroughly transformed, his heart open to the human community and the interconnections that join people together. Now he can see the value of meal and games with his one relative. Now he understands how his life is intertwined with that of a crippled boy. Now it suddenly occurs to him that his clerk's work makes his wealth possible, and he becomes willing to share both the profit and the coal. Our redemption is like Scrooge's. It comes not from finally having enough that we feel secure enough to give some away. Rather, it comes with a sense of connectedness to others and a realization that all of our possessions are gifts to us of life and love. The ghost didn't promise Scrooge security or continued wealth or dispensation from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. They only reminded him of the value of life and love and the connections that bind us one to another. And that was enough. So, what Scrooge said? He said at the end of the story, in words much less iconic but much more beautiful and much more wise, he said, "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year." I have a much more modest hope for you, which is that you will honor Christmas in your heart and keep it for the next 2 weeks. I hope you will find joy in your relationships, gratitude for all the gifts of life, and pleasure in your generosity. And as for keeping Christmas all the rest of the year, there's no better advice than Marley's. To remember that your business as a human being is charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence, all grand old words, which all boil down to treating others as you would wish to be treated, and that in a spirit of love. Merry Christmas, and God bless us, everyone.